I had only $3 in my pocket, and the sun was sinking low behind the jagged ridges of the mountains, casting long, molten shadows across the dry, trembling earth. The wind had a scratchy voice that rustled the mesquite and carried the scent of dust and distant pine smoke. My horse, a stubborn chestnut mare named Daisy, had barely made a sound for hours, her hooves kicking up the fine sand as we crested the last hill before the ranch. The heat of the day still clung to the air, wrapping around me like a heavy, damp blanket, and my throat burned with thirst. I had learned long ago on the trail that the West does not take kindly to those unprepared, and at that moment, $3 might as well have been a handful of pebbles when the world seemed determined to swallow a man whole. From the ridge, I could see the ranch sprawled below, a patchwork of sun-bleached wood and corral fences. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney of the main cabin, curling upward into the cobalt sky like a lazy spirit rising from the earth. The fields beyond the house were sparse, dotted with grazing cattle whose ribs shone in the dying sunlight. The ranch was mine in name, though it often felt more like a caretaker's burden than a home. Still, after days of wandering and negotiating with strangers whose eyes were sharper than their tongues, seeing that familiar outline brought a peculiar comfort, a small, stubborn kind of hope. As I guided Daisy down the rough trail toward the gate, I noticed a movement near the water trough. At first, I thought it was a tumbleweed caught in a gust, but then I saw her, a woman, her skin the color of sun-baked clay, her hair dark and tangled, her clothes ragged and streaked with dust that clung to her in stubborn patches. She knelt by the trough, dipping her hands into the shallow water and lifting it to her parched lips. She froze when she saw me, and for a moment, the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes, dark and wary, met mine, and I felt that peculiar, piercing recognition of someone who had traveled far and carried more than a few burdens on her shoulders. "Please," she said, her voice roughened by the dry wind and the long miles, may I wash at your ranch?" There was no flourish in her plea, no attempt to charm or soften it. It was raw, stripped of ceremony or pretense, as if the words themselves were a thin veil over the desperation etched into her features. I glanced down at her hands, cracked and trembling from the heat, and then at the simple wooden fence separating the corral from the trail. In that instant, I realized that asking a favor of a stranger in the West was always a gamble. I knew the stories, the warnings. Not everyone who begged for help was innocent, and the desert could chew up the unwary as easily as it could the desperate. And yet, there was something about the way she held herself, the quiet dignity beneath the dust and exhaustion, that pricked at the edges of my suspicion. I dismounted slowly, keeping my hand near my belt, where the Colt rested in its worn leather holster. Daisy stamped once, impatient, and the woman flinched at the sound, though she didn't move away. I studied her more closely now. She was thin, but not frail. Her eyes, almond-shaped, dark, and luminous, carried a hardness, a sharp intelligence, and a kind of sorrow I couldn't quite name. Her clothes were simple, a dress of muted brown fabric, torn at the hem, dust-coated, and patched in several places. A shawl, once vibrant, hung around her shoulders, faded to a dull tan by sun and wind. Around her neck, a small necklace of turquoise beads caught the last rays of sunlight, the stones flickering like tiny embers. "I don't usually let strangers on my land," I said cautiously, keeping my tone. Especially women traveling alone. It ain't safe." She nodded, dipping her hands back into the water. "I know. I've walked many miles. I have nothing but what I carry," she said. Her voice had a musical undertone, soft and lilting despite the weariness. "I can pay, if you'll allow it. I have a few coins, but only $3. She held out her hand, the gesture trembling, and I saw the faint, stubborn hope in her eyes. $3, barely enough for a meal in town, let alone the kind of hospitality she sought, but there was something in her demeanor that made me hesitate. Something in the tilt of her head, the way she balanced dignity with need, that told me she wasn't lying or scheming. I sighed, running a hand over my face, tasting the grit in my mouth. The West had a way of testing a man's patience and his generosity, often at the same time. "All right," I said finally, tipping my hat back to get the sweat off my brow. "You can wash at the trough. But stay near the house. No wandering." Her face lit up in a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile, and she inclined her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, as though the words were too heavy to carry in full. Then, carefully, she rose and began to walk toward the ranch, each step measured, her feet leaving faint impressions in the dry soil. I watched her for a moment, noting the slight limp in her stride, and wondered what had brought her to this place, under this sun, with so little to her name. The corral gate creaked as I pushed it open, letting Daisy step in, and I led her toward the stable. The woman paused at the edge of the yard, watching me, then moved to the water trough near the house. She knelt again, dipping her hands into the cool, shallow water and lifting them to her face. Dust peeled away in fine layers, drifting into the air like smoke, revealing skin that had been hidden beneath the cloak of dirt and travel. For a long moment, she let the water run over her hands, splashing a little onto the parched ground, and I noticed the tension in her shoulders easing, as though the simple act of washing was a reprieve from the unrelenting hardships she had endured. I went about my chores, feeding the chickens and checking the corral fences, keeping a cautious eye on her. The sun sank lower, setting the mountains ablaze in fiery oranges and purples, and I could see the faint trail of dust rising behind her as she worked quietly. Every so often, she looked up, catching my gaze, and I returned it with a nod. There was an unspoken agreement between us, distance and respect, acknowledgement of need, and the shared understanding that the world could be cruel, and sometimes kindness was a rare currency. When she finally stood, water dripping from her hands, she hesitated, glancing around the ranch as if memorizing every detail. Then she walked toward the cabin, her steps careful on the wooden porch, and I could see the muscles in her arms, lean and strong from years of work and travel. She didn't speak, but the gratitude in her eyes was clear, a quiet acknowledgement of the small mercy I had granted her. $3 might have seemed trivial in other places, but in this stretch of desert, it was the difference between survival and continued suffering, and she seemed acutely aware of it. I fetched a rag from the cabin, setting it on the trough, and watched her dry her face and arms. There was a stillness to her movements, a rhythm that suggested patience born from hardship. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and finally turned to face me fully. "I am grateful," she said again. Her accent hinted at distant plains, of lands far from this ranch, of people whose language carried the weight of history and struggle. "You are kind, sir. Few were in these parts." I nodded, shrugging modestly. "Kindness is a rare thing," I said, "but sometimes, it's all a man has to offer." My voice sounded rough even to me, but the truth of it lingered in the air, mingling with the scents of dust and pine. The sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving a twilight glow over the ranch, and for a moment, there was nothing but the soft sounds of evening, the low hum of insects, the cluck of a chicken, the rustle of leaves, and the presence of someone who, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, had walked into my life and demanded attention, if only for a brief moment. We stood there, the two of us, in the quiet after the day's heat, the wind settling into a gentle murmur. I could sense her exhaustion, but also a resilience that made me respect her. She had traveled long and hard, carrying nothing but determination and a few coins, and yet she faced me, a stranger, with courage instead of fear. In the West, courage was a kind of currency itself, often worth more than money or land. And in that moment, I realized that my $3, though meager, were the smallest part of what this encounter represented: trust, survival, and a fleeting connection in a harsh, uncaring land. Night crept in slowly, the sky deepening to indigo, and stars began to prick the darkness with cold fire. The ranch took on a different character at night, the fences long shadows, the cabins glowing faintly from the warmth within. The Apache woman, no longer just a figure of dust and desperation, moved about with quiet purpose, tending to what little she could manage near the porch, her eyes occasionally lifting to the stars as if searching for guidance or comfort. And I, leaning against the rail of the corral, felt the weight of the day and the strange, stubborn hope that had arrived with her presence. For all the loneliness that life on the frontier brought, for all the struggles and scarcity, there was something enduring about these moments: the meeting of strangers, the softening of barriers, the acknowledgement that even in a world ruled by hardship, generosity could still be found, and trust could still be earned. $3, I thought, could never measure the value of that.